For many of you, you may not know that Andrew's been fascinated with unexplained cardiac arrest for the last 30 years or so, and he's going to share an exciting update with the group. Andrew, over to you.
Absolutely. So a couple things I'll start with, and I'll just go to, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So around late 90s, I guess, I remember meeting Angela. Angela was in her early 30s, and she had a cardiac arrest while supervising her kids at a birthday pool party. And she had jumped in and didn't get out of the water, and then got fished out and resuscitated and everything. And I remember pondering the question, what is the cause of this? Because her preliminary testing showed sort of borderline LV function and maybe a little left anterior hemiblock, sort of non-specific things. And part of this triggered in conversation with an Aussie fellow and my EP colleagues the question, what's going on here? She didn't have the typical findings or exercise testing that made me think she clearly had CPVT, which was a relatively new phenomenon back then. But this is, that's sort of how some of this started. And so what I wanted to do today actually is just show you that I think we've made huge leaps and bounds in this area of evaluating these patients and providing guidance, and now looking at diagnosis and evolution of diagnosis. And Chris Chung, maybe at our next round like this, will be presenting something on outcomes in terms of the probability of interventions with their ICDs in general and so on. So that's the context. I also wanted to put in a plug for something that I've advocated for, which is last time the Corneals were kind enough to, in a way, be our patient partner hosts for this event. And we had somebody who was going to tell their personal story, and the timing didn't work out, except that May joined at the very end because he has a life and had some obligations. But I do believe in the idea of, just like there's a land acknowledgement for meeting space and those kind of things, that I want to have a family acknowledgement, that families are crucial and they're a big reason why we do this. And I like the idea that HiRO meetings start with family acknowledgements and have patient partners visible. So this is just a quick illustration. And what I want to do is give you an update of where we're at with what happens in these patients. So the first is, like most things in here, what happens is you have a single center that has an idea, accumulates enough data to sort of say, this is something of interest to us. And then the way to really understand this is to do what we've done, which is build this large village that we're in, and that's meeting today to look at this. So this is the first paper. And then the next paper that looked at this, and now you can see the number of authors goes up, because now we're enrolling more centers and more participants and more patients and so on. And that's 2009. And then huge credit to Rafik and Brianna, who went through the process of creating essentially a lexicon of the diagnostic criteria for the different diagnoses, and then pushed all of us to go through a diagnostic reevaluation of the working diagnosis to make sure that they had what we thought they had, or what they were coded as having. And that happened kind of in the 2015 to 18. So it's not totally reflected in the next paper, which was in 200 apparently unexplained cardiac arrests that had a sufficient and full workup. And again, more centers, more patients, more authors, and so on. And that leads us to our modern day. So this is the last updated and reviewed working diagnosis on the patients that have had a previous out-of-hospital cardiac arrest that are in HiRO. And I'll walk you through a little bit, and we have both a tabular, because some people are interested in numbers, and also a graphic version of this, because it has some pretty key components to it that I think are take-home messages for the purpose of advising patients of how this turns out, what the yield is of what they're going through to undergo evaluation, and so on. And so I think there's a key point here that I'll make, and one of the points is, we have about 80 patients who don't have complete data sets yet, where it's still trickling in from their initial event and data completion and so on. But we have almost 1,000 of these cardiac arrest patients. So that's a huge opportunity to learn from them and understand both their diagnosis and also their outcome. So this is just another graphic way of looking at it, that of those cardiac arrest patients, half of them remain unexplained. So if you're at the bedside talking to a patient or in the clinic, you can for sure tell them that at least half of patients, despite all our best efforts, will not arrive at a specific diagnosis. Depending on the definition, the follow-up in these patients is in the order of 6 to 8 years. So it's not short term. We're really looking at these people in some detail. And so what you see, and Brianna's done a great job with some numbers and slide creation here to look at, in the blue on the right side are the unexplained cardiac arrests. And then the four colors are really divided into categories. So, the orange is the repolarization related things like short coupled VF and early repol. The light orange or yellow is more the cardiomyopathies. The gray at the bottom are the channelopathies, and the blue are the odds and ends, which includes Weil's nice presentation on mitral valve prolapse. And it's also myocarditis and coronary spasm and some odds and ends, other forms of cardiomyopathies as well. And so then what you do, you remember we started at 919. So then what happens is, if you take a patient who's had a cardiac arrest who's in HiRO, some of those patients have evident either cardiomyopathy or channelopathy basically after an ECG, a cath, plus or minus an echo that identifies overt Mendelian inherited syndromes. And then you're left with 750 patients who then are Casper eligible in the sense that they go through the whole enchilada. So the whole enchilada is the combination of procainamide challenge, MRI, genetic testing, and so on, all being considered and delivered based on clinical suspicion and local resources and so on. And then when you look at their diagnoses, then once you get to those patients who don't have obvious disease and you then put them through the Casper diagnostic evaluation, here's a take-home message. 2/3 of those people will be unexplained, 65%. Okay, so again, if you get after you completed the preliminary stuff, you could tell 2/3 of those people, we're going to put you through all of this. And we hope with thorough evaluation and further time, about 1/3 of those people we will arrive at a diagnosis, but 2/3 we won't. And there'll be a mix of things from these IVF syndromes, channelopathies, cardiomyopathies, and these others. And the other thing that isn't explicit, but I want to point out here, is that if you look at the gray and the light orange or yellow, the 8 and 6 add up to 14% are things that are overtly familial. And that matters for when you're counseling them about the possibility of families being affected and the need for family screening and what you're looking for. And this is just, again, a nice graphic version of this same explanation of now when we get to not obvious cardiac arrest, or not obvious channelopathy or cardiomyopathy, then 2/3 of the patients are unexplained and these other parameters. So this is a very nice sort of graphic walkthrough of these people. And there's a couple messages to take here. So remember, we started at the beginning with this idea that in HiRO we have 919 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. And then when they undergo that ECG echo sort of preliminary testing, we take 18% off. So if you think, for example, that most of the patients who have cardiac arrests are patients where it's first presentation with long QT or ARVC or Brugada or CPVT, that's not the case. 80% of them are apparently unexplained until you really dig. Okay, and that matters from the standpoint of advising your cardiology community and critical care people who are looking after these people after arrest, and also when you advise patients about the purpose of undertaking the thorough evaluation. And then when you dig into those people, that's 750, then you'll find 1/3 of those people will have some diagnosis, okay? And this is after a year when you've had time to complete that investigation, including outpatient things like procainamides and MRIs and genetic testing and stuff. And so then the next question is, so that's sort of our last look at the diagnosis after they've been followed and revisited and undergone further phenotyping, or they've had events, and then we've had an ability to interpret the events. And so what this looks at here now is if you look on the current working diagnosis, so that's the middle column. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but in the middle column where it's with 2 asterisks at the top, and then the baseline diagnosis based on the first time somebody said, this is our working diagnosis of what's going on. And what's happened here is that over time, there's been evolution of diagnosis. And so a good example is short coupled VF, which we had a nice paper on last year. So that is a diagnosis that requires recording the event. And so although a minority of those were identified early because they had recurrence and it was recorded or during the resuscitation process, the majority of those are actually diagnosed in follow-up, either with ICD or emergency room-related recordings. If you look at some other things where there's been change, we found more early repolarization as an example, but for long QT, we had a lot of those baseline diagnoses and we removed most of them. And the reason that happened is because we came to realize that epinephrine infusions had a high false positive rate. And the longer we looked with genetics and exercise testing, the less evidence there was of any long QT as a diagnosis. So we removed that diagnosis. And then the other major one that's new, although most of the cardiomyopathies are new, we had a little less. We actually downgraded some ARVC diagnoses because my bias is that often imaging gives overly supportive evidence for it that just doesn't pan out with the other parameters. And then as Wael pointed out, that over time, either our recognition or progression of disease, we saw more mitral valve prolapse. So in the end, 24% of patients had evolution of diagnosis over the course of their follow-up, either because we learned limitations of tests or knew what to look for, or they developed disease. The sort of 3 main categories of evolution of disease and diagnosis. So, and that's just graphically summarized here in these patients who, again, 1 year on the left is the 1 year post-arrest diagnosis. And then after a mean of 7 years, this is the diagnostic complexion in a pie diagram on the right. And if you look carefully, the blues, the dark blues, unexplained, are about the same. And as Brianna will say, in some incredible coincidence, and I think she's quintuple checked it, we actually, with all those shifting diagnoses, we still ended up with 488 in both groups, even though they're not the same patients. But the proportion that are light blue, orange, gray, and yellow has evolved as we follow, clarify, have new diagnostic information, develop new tests, and so on. So I think this is a pretty compelling data set from the standpoint of this. I think this is a high impact paper, and we're working in that direction. I will also say I think that some of the take home messages are about 20% of your arrests will actually have an obvious cause before they get to a Casper workup. Second thing is about a third of those left after that will have a diagnosis that will emerge either with a thorough evaluation or over time. The fourth is you're going to have to tell patients that 2/3 of patients will never get a diagnosis, not like in the usual event horizon of sort of 5 to 10 years. And one of the key things that Chris is working on with outcomes is to try to identify if there are characteristics of people who are what Shu Sanatani calls one and done, which are patients who had an arrest that will never come back, they'll never use their ICD. And because those are patients where their outcome and their driving eligibility for commercial driving and a bunch of other parameters are very relevant to counseling their sort of burden and prognosis. So I think with that, because it was intended to be a quick update, I'll stop and very interested in hearing comments or questions.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to start by asking you, over the last 10 years, do you think that your approach to patients with unexplained cardiac arrest in terms of investigations, selecting tests for them to undergo as part of their workup, I'm thinking specifically about epinephrine challenges and sodium channel blockade, has that evolved as a result of some of the data that we've produced?
Yeah, I think after our epinephrine paper, which is now about 10 years old, it took a couple years of sort of processing that information to realize that it just wasn't a good test. And then when you look carefully, the small number of controls in the data that developed the test had some concerning findings. And so after that, over time, I basically advocated that unless you couldn't get on a treadmill, the epinephrine test was not particularly useful unless they had an adrenergic arrest. So, in other words, if the patient, collapses during a 5K run, then they'll get an epinephrine test just because we're being thorough and researchy, but not because we're looking for long QT.
And I was wondering, do we have any idea from the actual Casper data or from the HiRO data in general whether or not there's a trend in the use of those tests amongst the wider network over time? Have we seen less epinephrine challenges being performed on our patients that are enrolled?
Yeah, the best person to answer that might be Brianna. I know that we haven't categorically looked at that. I know for sure that we're doing less epinephrine tests.
Yeah, I can just add that it's definitely decreased in the Casper data set. We hardly have any in the last few years that have had epinephrine tests performed. But I could look at exact numbers. That would be interesting.
Yeah, I think if I was going to invest, I'd invest in genetic testing before I'd do an epinephrine challenge. You're more likely to get, I think, what you might call inferential evidence that could support. Looks like Joe has a question or comment.
Yeah, we have one in the chat as well, actually, which was one I was going to ask you about how we make inroads into this group, the 2/3, where nothing's changing at 1 year, 7 years follow-up. How do we break into that group?
So, so I had a patient who was at the age of 15 had a somewhat exertion-related arrest happen, and we saw him in clinic last week. And 14 years later, he had a second arrest. So, from a clinician perspective, this is why we replace the ICD when nothing's happened, is because we're not that smart to know for sure. The flip side is that if you look at our short coupled VF literature, and you look at the Dutch version of this, and you talk to Sammy Visken, who was a big part of sort of the discovery description of some of this, there is an argument that unexplained cardiac arrest is short coupled VF waiting to happen. So it's the one thing you can't diagnose and you can't predict, and it doesn't have a phenotype, and we don't have a provocation test. But the problem is it can be quiet for years and then it just shows up. So I have to think there's something going on there. I think our endeavors into machine learning, giving our data holdings, has the potential to, I think, move it forward a bit in answer to HC's question. My concern is those answers will be small increments. They won't be transformational. So I'm not quite sure. That's why it's called research.
Yep, for sure. Joe, do you want to come back? Your hand went up and then went down again. I don't know if we asked the same question you were going to ask, but I was trying to go first come, first serve. But come back.
No worries. Yeah, I did have a question. I'll just follow up on that comment. We had done a study on a small group of patients with presenting with a cardiac arrest, 100 and some pediatric patients, looking again for unexplained and their outcomes. They all had an ICD, and similarly, about half had no explanation, but the incidence of appropriate shock was the same between the two. So again, humbling. We may not know what it is, what causes it, but it seems like the risk maybe is comparable. But again, smaller study. My question, Andrew. Well, first, very nice kind of review of the registry, and again, congratulations. You had showed the kind of decrease in the number of patients diagnosed with long QT when reviewed over time, which we have all seen. But I was surprised to see that the same for CPVT. I would have thought the opposite, a higher frequency of underdiagnosing CPVT early on and figuring out later on, either by a better recognition or an omitted stress test and so on. Any comments on the CPVT phenotype?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll tie into, I just looked in the chat, and Chris Chung has a question too about whether there's sort of evolution of enrollment. And I think there's two things on the CPVT side of things, because Chris is on to a very good point. So one is we didn't actually formally look for CPVT in terms of a reimbursed enrollment data collection system outside of a few sites that were interested who enrolled outside of active advocacy. And so I think what's happened is in pediatric sites, a person can in principle present with CPVT, an 8-year-old who collapses during recess playing on the playground, and they don't get in. They don't get in because they have a diagnosis before they're considered unexplained. And so now we'd have to repatriate those people into being enrolled retrospectively into the registry to be able to be captured, to be prevalent with CPVT. So I think that's one thing. I think the second part of things is that, so now, for example, if you see somebody who comes in with bileaflet prolapse, 10 millimeters of disjunction, complex ventricular ectopy, will you call that unexplained cardiac arrest and put them in HiRO? You might not, right? Because now we think we're smart enough to know that that's an explained cardiac arrest. So we do run the risk of a decreasing diagnostic yield over time because we've hived off these recognized diagnoses as non-eligible. But the corollary of that is, technically they are eligible because the eligibility criteria still would have included them initially and would now. And we haven't really talked about refining that selection process for enrollment beyond the relatively, broad enrollment criteria that we have. So the other thing, Joe, is that, there's this concept of adult onset CPVT, and there are patients who have, exertion-related concerning events with polymorphic ectopy, and there's still some vagueness. They're more likely to be gene negative and less family history. Are they potentially CRDS? Are they phenocopies like ACMs without much cardiomyopathy, like a lamin A, for example? So we still have a bunch of work to do to sort of understand the adrenergic aspect of things and the syndromes that we have labels for.
Thank you. Yeah, that does make sense. I guess the bias is at the enrollment site. And if you were to look at the HiRO registry, including patients enrolled initially with whatever diagnosis, that may not look the same.
Yeah, so a shout out to the folks in Ontario who went through the heroic efforts of advocacy at the political level to end up having, a syncope policy, and in other places with resuscitation policies around schools. And those things, for instance, might make the sentinel syncope event in CPVT a more likely basis for diagnosis and enrollment in HiRO. Before they have their cardiac arrest. So maybe cardiac arrests and CPVT are going down because of syncope awareness. We would hope so.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the excellent discussion. Any other questions we want to put to Andrew? We can't see any other hands up. Nothing else in the chat. Perfect. All right. Andrew, thank you. That's really, really great. Great presentation. Thank you for answering the question. I don't see anything.
Again, and great job for chairing, guys.
Thank you. That's been great. So from myself and from David, a huge thank you. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to Brianna and Simran for all the hard work they do behind the scenes. Just to say again, the session was recorded. And if you didn't know, that HiRO actually has a YouTube account. So this will be on the HiRO YouTube channel within a week or so. Also, a quick shout out, the HiRO Annual Symposium this year is going to be held in Toronto on the 6th to the 8th of June. And more information is going to be following about that very soon, I hope. And that's going to be hosted by Jason Roberts. Again, thank you, everybody. We hope you have a pleasant evening, and thanks for joining.